Hello, this is BBC World News. I'm Ben Boulos. Our top stories. The British government defends its decision to lift coronavirus restrictions in England, including mask wearing and social distancing. For some, that means the long wait is over, but for many others, it is an anxious moment as the country sees a surge in COVID infections. More positive coronavirus tests among Olympic athletes and officials as thousands pour into Tokyo, where the Games begin on Friday. As floodwaters in Germany recede, the clean-up begins. The effort is expected to cost hundreds of millions of euros.
And I'm Kasia Madeira, live from the historic town of Euskirchen, where scenes like these are repeated in many areas across this part of Western Germany.
The US, EU and Britain say a huge cyber attack that targeted Microsoft Exchange servers earlier this year came from China. Hello and a very warm welcome to BBC News. It's good to have you with us. It's being called Freedom Day by some, as today England lifts most legal restrictions on social contact. There are now no limits on how many people can meet, and table service won't be necessary in pubs and bars. But the British Prime Minister has urged everyone to remain cautious, with a warning that the number of new infections will surge further. From today, Monday the 19th, face coverings are not required by law, although they are recommended in some crowded public spaces, such as public transport. Nightclubs can reopen and theatres and cinemas can return to full capacity. This is despite concern about a wave of new cases, more than 50,000 per day across the United Kingdom. More than 500,000 alerts telling people to quarantine were sent by the National Health Service COVID-19 app in England and Wales in the first week of July. Lakshmi Gopal has this report and a warning it contains some flashing images.
6, 5, 4.
The moment they've been waiting for over a year. The final stage of unlocking in England, with social distancing rules dropped. 1,000 people packed into this club in central London, with many more lining up outside. They've waited 16 months. What's a little longer?
There's so many people here, and we're just so pumped to get in there.
It's been a year and a half, and now we're all just ready to start.
I've had my vaccines. I want to have a good time, hon.
So excited. So excited, can't wait for it.
It's just like a relief after such a long time, just to have freedom.
Nightclubs are one of the few businesses that have had to stay closed throughout the whole pandemic, among the last to reopen.
And this is what many have waited so long for, and what the nightlife industry has so desperately needed.
Some feel the sector has been sidelined.
The last year has been hell on earth. I mean, it's been very, very difficult. If you look at what happened last week with the football compared with what's happening tonight, and you think, why were we treated differently?
All we're doing is taking the screens out, putting them into storage.
It's more sedate, but no less celebratory at this pub in West London, where they're preparing for an end to table service only and mandatory masks.
I can't wait to enjoy doing our job rather than sort of having to basically be a policeman the whole time and just lecturing people on what they can and can't do, where they can and can't go, the masks they wear, what they touch, where they sanitize, where they track and trace. It's going to be strange for us to adapt again, and the notion of people coming into the pub, being able to go to the table themselves without being directed.
There is concern about restrictions easing at a time when COVID cases in the UK are rising.
We're at the point where 10% just over intensive care beds in England are occupied by people who have got COVID. So there's been a significant increase in pressure on intensive care services over the last few weeks.
With experts warning that cases could surge further, and with a third of adults not yet fully vaccinated, the worry is at what price this new freedom? Lakshmi Gopal, BBC News.
Well, joining us now is Martin Hibberd, who is a professor of emerging infectious diseases at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And Martin, it's good to have you with us. In your expert assessment, is this the right move at the right time to lift these restrictions now?
Well, it's complicated. Epidemiologically, it makes some sense to open up over the summer, but we have to think about the effects on the NHS and whether they can cope with that. With the rising numbers of people, mostly, luckily, younger people who are not going to be so seriously affected, we have to worry about those people that will be affected and what that's going to happen to the NHS.
When we look at the graphs, yes, there is a sharp rise in the number of new cases, but what we're not seeing, thankfully, is a similarly sharp rise as we've seen before in the number of hospitalisations or deaths. Does that suggest that the pandemic, as far as the UK or as far as England is concerned, is now moving to a stage where we have to start thinking about how we return to normality and live alongside the virus?
Well, certainly we have to start thinking about that. And we do have to think about the exit strategies, from all of this. But you can think of it as, at the moment, just over half the people are fully protected. And so that leaves a large number of vulnerable people. And as we've heard, NHS numbers are building up, and it's whether we can cope with that. And that's a little bit what's unknown at the moment, is how that balance is going to work out.
I just wonder what effect it has when one country or one nation like England decides to lift restrictions. Does that have any effect elsewhere in the world?
So we're looking at the variant strains. We're dealing with the Delta variant at the moment, and that's what's led to these increasing cases and ease of transmission. Our previous regulations could control the Alpha variant, but haven't done so well with the Delta. And around the world, there are a number of new variants turning up every day, and one of those maybe can outcompete this new Delta variant. So that is a concern, what's happening and how those new strains are coming. But that's something perhaps we can keep an eye out. What I worry about is that we might be generating a vaccine-resistant variant, and that's something we have to keep careful eye on to make sure that that doesn't happen. Otherwise, we might be back into a difficult situation of having to close again.
I mean, that's a very alarming phrase to hear. It's the first reference I've heard to that, to be honest, Martin. But I just wonder, if that did happen, what more can be done? What's the next step from there in terms of fighting the virus?
Well, we have a strategy and plan for that. We now know we can make very effective vaccines. And in fact, there are new vaccines coming through that might lead to these booster shots, perhaps a little bit later on in the year. And I think we're ready for that should it eventually happen. But we need to keep our eyes open and be prepared rather than being behind the curve. We should be ready and prepared.
OK, Martin, really good to get your thoughts on that, an expert take on it all. Martin Hibberd from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Tokyo Olympics begin this week, but there is already a growing number of athletes and officials testing positive for COVID-19 or being forced to self-isolate. In the Olympic Village, 2 players and a coach for the South African men's football team have the virus. 8 members of Team GB Athletics are also in isolation after being in close contact with positive cases. Earlier, I spoke to our correspondent, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, in Tokyo and asked him if this is the scenario the organisers had been dreading or if it just shows that the testing system is working.
Certainly the Olympic Organising Committee here in Tokyo and the International Olympic Committee are both saying it is the latter, that it shows that the system is working, that cases are being detected early and that the athletes or the staff members affected can be put into self-isolation and kept away from the rest of their team and from other people in the Olympic Village and elsewhere. And so there is nothing to be too worried about at the moment. There's no reason to panic that this is not an indication that the Olympics is in danger. However, I think what we've seen over the last few months is that this has been a sort of a moving target. As things have got worse in the last few months with COVID infections in Japan entering a 4th wave, we've seen the Olympic Organising Committee sort of tighten its regulations, increase testing, and make this bubble around the Olympics tighter and tighter. And it does suggest that they were not expecting this to happen at least a few weeks ago, and it has taken them somewhat by surprise.
And have they addressed some of the, I suppose, the sporting issues around it? Because if athletes are having to isolate, they can't prepare in the way they might have wanted to. So they may say they have a competitive disadvantage when they come to competing. Equally, others may feel that, yes, they have a victory, they have a medal, but if one of the strongest competitors in the field wasn't able to take part, is it a sort of a hollow victory? Have they addressed any of those issues?
Not as far as I'm aware, and this is, you've pointed exactly to the problem that is going to arise more and more as we see, inevitably, I think, more of the people arriving in Japan testing positive and being forced to isolate. And it's not just those who are testing positive, it's anybody who's been in close contact. So, for example, we now have 8 members of Team GB in self-isolation, and they'll have to stay in self-isolation until they've had 2 negative COVID tests over the next few days before they can return to training. That means even though they may be completely clear of COVID, that is going to affect their ability to prepare for their competition, which could start as soon as 4 or 5 days' time. And so, yes, this is going to be tremendously disruptive, and how exactly they're going to square that circle, how if you have been unable to train and you have to go up against someone who's been in full training, is that going to be taken into account during the competition? We simply don't know the answer to that, and I suspect there isn't an answer to that so far.
Rupert Wingfield-Hayes there in Tokyo. Do stay with us here on BBC World News. Plenty more still to come, including this. Politicians in Germany demanding to know why a flood warning system didn't save more lives in the devastating floods last week. We'll be live in the area to find out the latest on the clean-up operation and the calls for federal cash to help those affected.
Coming down the ladder now. It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
A catastrophic engine fire is being blamed tonight for the first crash in the 30-year history of Concorde, the world's only supersonic airliner.
It was one of the most vivid symbols of the violence and hatred that tore apart the state of Yugoslavia. But now, a decade later, it's been painstakingly rebuilt and opens again today.
There's been a 50% decrease in sperm quantity and an increase in malfunctioning sperm unable to swim properly.
Thousands of households across the country are suspiciously quiet this lunchtime as children bury their noses in the final instalment of Harry Potter.
Hello, I'm Ben. This is BBC World News, the latest headlines. Most coronavirus restrictions come to an end in England, with nightclubs reopening for the first time. But for many, it is an anxious time, with cases in the country surging. More positive coronavirus tests among Olympic athletes and officials as thousands pour into Tokyo, where the Games begin on Friday. German politicians have described catastrophic failings in a flood warning system that failed to save the lives of about 160 people last week. Officials say the system worked properly, but politicians said there should have been more warnings. The economy minister says a thorough investigation should be about preparing for the future, not about apportioning blame. In the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, Euskirchen is one of the worst affected areas. There were concerns that the Steinbachtal Dam might be breached, leading to thousands of people being evacuated. Kasia Madeira is there and tells us how they are dealing with the aftermath.
People's lives destroyed by the floodwaters, damaged, piled up on the streets. This is the historic town of Euskirchen. It's one of many where these scenes are repeated. Time and time again, we've been travelling through this part of Western Germany and we see scenes like this, just stuff piled outside as people come to terms with what's happened. The recovery, the clean-up operation is absolutely huge in this area. The Interior Minister of the country was here visiting a little bit earlier, and he promised solidarity in a big relief effort that will be on a national scale. And it will need to be, given that this is just one small town in a large region that has suffered so much. Damien McGuinness has this full update.
The rains have stopped and the floodwaters are receding, but that also means the true extent of the destruction is becoming clear. Countless numbers of people have lost everything, and the region's infrastructure has been torn apart. Roads and bridges have been destroyed, and there are still areas without basic amenities.
There's neither electricity nor drinking water. I don't know what to say. I must stop to take a break now and then and talk to people, otherwise I'll go crazy.
Within the space of 2 days, 2 large states were hit by more rainfall than they usually get in 2 months, causing the region's many rivers to burst their banks. In the village of Schult, the floodwaters destroyed and in some cases even washed away houses. And in one town near Cologne, the water created landslides which undermined a row of homes and a castle. It had survived for centuries, but wasn't able to withstand the onslaught of the floods. Often, people had just minutes to get to safety.
I woke up about 11 p.m. and stepped into the water with a depth of about 20 centimetres when I got off the bed. I couldn't have imagined how fast the water would rise if I hadn't experienced it on my own.
I don't know what to do. I have 4 kids. This is really a disaster. No one told me how long it would take to rebuild this place, which may take a year or 2 years. We are out of work. How to carry out the reconstruction is the biggest issue.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel has visited the region and expressed her shock at the destruction. On Wednesday, her cabinet will agree a rescue package for these areas. As the devastated areas are cleaned up and rebuilt, though, pressure will grow on the German government to fulfil its promises. Damien McGuinness, BBC News, Nuremberg, in Rhineland-Palatinate.
Well, the Interior Minister promised a huge relief effort, a lot of support for what's really needed in these particular areas that have been so badly damaged. He was here visiting a dam because at one point there was concern that the dam may breach. Luckily, that is now secure. But at that press conference that he was giving, I was able to catch up with his deputy, the Deputy Interior Minister, and I asked him just about what kind of preparations they have when they talk about things like climate change, because of course a lot of conversation about why so much water fell in this particular part of the world. This was his response.
One of the biggest, European-wide biggest single projects on climate protection is to go out of the brown coal mining. And this is actually the area. It's not very far from here, the Rhinish brown coal mining area. And we're going out of this. And that's, I think, a very important contribution to climate protection. A really high reduction of carbon dioxide. So this is one of the biggest project, maybe the European-wide biggest project on climate protection. And this is just one example.
But in a sentence, would you say what we saw, the devastation, the destruction, the washing machines out on the streets, is it because of climate change?
I think it's very, very likely that what we saw, heavy rains here and also the damage, is because of climate change, and that's why we're acting on climate change.
So still that caveat that it's likely that it was climate change, and that conversation will grow because this cleanup operation will take a long time, and it will take an awful lot of money to rebuild as well, because many of these homes have been gutted. These are businesses that will not be operational for a long time. People have been evacuated. They need to move somewhere else. It's an immense recovery that will need to take place in this area, and this will take months, if not possibly even years. It will feed into the election that is coming up at the end of September, when of course Angela Merkel is finally standing down after 16 years as leader of this country. So at the moment what we have here are people that are still shell shocked and just people's lives discarded on these streets.
OK, Kasia, thank you very much for that. Kasia Madeira there for us in Germany. The UK and European Union have accused China of carrying out a major cyber attack earlier this year. The attack targeted Microsoft Exchange servers and affected over 250,000 servers all around the world. The countries have also accused the Chinese Ministry of State Security of other espionage activity. With me is our security correspondent, Gordon Carrera. Gordon, does this accusation come as anything different to what we've heard in the past, where China's been accused of state-backed sort of espionage?
This is a significant escalation. Firstly, we've seen the EU come out, the UK, but also in the last few hours the US, NATO, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, an unusually broad alliance of countries calling out China. The reason being that they think some of this activity was particularly reckless. That Microsoft Exchange hack, which happened earlier this year, compromised certainly tens of thousands of machines at the very least. And it created a backdoor which then other hackers, including criminal groups, were able to exploit. So there was a sense that this was a different type of behaviour and a more reckless behaviour linked to the Chinese state, which a range of countries wanted to call out as unacceptable. So they've come out today in the hope that this might change behaviour. China, of course, has denied its involvement in this hack in the past.
And so this type of attack sounds like it's different from other cyber attacks that we've reported on.
Well, there's an element in which this started off as espionage, which is pretty much traditional, and which all countries do, and Russia's been accused of it recently with SolarWinds, but certainly the US, the UK and others also carry out espionage. But there was a moment in late February where this attack kind of switched, where basically it went from a targeted attack to a mass attack in which tens of thousands of computers in small businesses and organisations were left vulnerable, and with the possibility of this risk being passed to other hackers and hacking groups. So I think that's what made this slightly different and why people wanted to call it out. The countries have also called out other Chinese espionage activity, more traditional espionage activity, if you like, and linked all of this to the Chinese Ministry of State Security. The hope is that this kind of very public attribution will push China to try and restrain some of those cyber actors from carrying out these kind of activities in the future.
And if China was behind these attacks, as they've accused China of being, what would it be hoping to achieve? Is it to spy on companies, to get corporate secrets? Is it to spy on governments? What's the purpose?
Well, I think traditionally what you've seen with China is accusations of espionage, trying to get hold of secrets, personal information which could be used, and intellectual property for commercial gain. So that, if you like, is traditional Chinese behaviour. The accusation is that in this case there was an extra element of recklessness in terms of the scale of what was going on and the kinds of organisations which were being compromised, leaving them vulnerable, as I said, to other hacking groups. And that's what made this slightly different from, if you like, traditional espionage, which all states do, including Western states.
OK. Gordon, thank you very much indeed. Gordon Carrera there, our security correspondent. A 2-year-old boy who was found apparently being smuggled in a migrant lorry to the United States has been reunited with his family in Honduras. Wilder Garcia was discovered along with more than 100 migrants in suffocating conditions. Tim Allman reports.
Back in his mother's arms after a harrowing adventure. Wilder Garcia looked happy enough, despite spending more than 2 weeks in the care of the Mexican authorities. After a cuddle with Mum, it was a drive cross-country and a reunion with most of the rest of his family.
Yesterday was a day when my life came back to me, because I saw him. He recognised me and ran towards me. I felt happy.
This was Wilder when he was found abandoned on a highway in southern Mexico, half naked and screaming for his parents, with bags of rubbish surrounding him. He set out with his father to travel to the US, but somewhere along the way they got separated. It was only when his story made international headlines that his mother recognised him on television. She's got her son back, but will she try to reach America again?
No, not anymore. It risks the lives of children. It's been sad what we went through. It's better to be poor and to keep on living.
Wilder's father is believed to be in an immigration centre in Mexico and will soon be sent back to Honduras. No happy ending in America, but a family reunited, safe and sound. Tim Allman, BBC News.
Tens of thousands of Muslim worshippers have ascended Mount Arafat near Mecca as they perform one of the most important rituals of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. They'll spend hours in prayer at the site where it's believed the Prophet Muhammad delivered his final sermon. For the second year running, the Saudi authorities have massively scaled down the pilgrimage due to the coronavirus pandemic. More than 2 million people would normally take part. This time, though, only 60,000 have been allowed to participate. All of them are Saudi nationals or foreign residents living in the kingdom. A reminder of our top story this hour. England lifts most legal restrictions on social contact. There are now no limits on how many people can meet, and table service will no longer be necessary in pubs and bars. But the British Prime Minister has urged everyone to remain cautious, warning that the number of new infections will surge further. From today, face coverings are not required by law, although they are still recommended in some crowded public spaces, such as on public transport. Nightclubs can reopen, theatres and cinemas can return to full capacity. And you can find out more about those restrictions being lifted. There are details on our website. Whenever you want to have a look, just go to bbc.com/news, or they're also on the BBC News app. You can reach me on social media. I'm on there at Ben M. Boulos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.